So good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining me this evening. This is a deep dive called Feeling Squirrely, and I thought it was fantastic that there was a Squirrel Appreciation Day, which is this Friday the 21st. So I want to talk a little bit about our fuzzy friends or our fuzzy enemies, depending on how much you love your bird seed and prefer to give it to birds and not any other critters that are out there. Squirrels can really engender some strong feelings, both positively and negatively. But I want to give you an idea of how big that family really is and talk about a few other things with them as well. So without further ado, I am going to go ahead and share my screen and get the presentation started here. All right, in 2 months they added a whole bunch of extra options. Oh, they did, but I was looking at the wrong icon. Here we go. All right. I'm gonna make it different each time. All right. So we're going to talk a little bit about squirrels. For some people, this is exactly how they feel about squirrels. Squirrels are rodents, and they're in the animal kingdom, and they're chordates. What I like to do usually with my programs is get a little setting of, or get a little idea of where we are in the tree of life. And so we kind of have a location on where we're talking about. So I hope that we can all agree that squirrels are, in fact, chordates or vertebrates. They have a backbone, and that they are rodents. Some of the rodents we will not be talking about this evening include the porcupine there on the left. There's I believe that's a white-footed mouse. That is a mouse that survived being trapped and removed from the nature center and was taken to another spot to give it a shot. Hopefully it worked. And then on the right is the American beaver, one of the two species of beaver you'll find, the other one being European. But none of these are in the family Squirrely. There are, I miswrote that. So please listen to my narrative as I talk about this. The family Squirrely includes the squirrels, chipmunks, and marmots. There are 2,277 species of rodents in 481 genera. 40% of all mammal species are rodents. So that first line is actually pertaining to rodents. There's about 279 species of squirrels worldwide, or 279 species in this squirrel family, in this family. We have 66 species in 8 genera in North America. Squirrels are found worldwide on most continents, not Antarctica. It kind of makes sense. Not a lot of trees. Not that every squirrel species needs trees, but it kind of makes sense with probably the general thought. There are 6 species in the family reported in Virginia, and 4 of them that are reported in Arlington. If you do a search for Squirrely on iNaturalist with those particular locations in mind. We're going to talk about that more. I feel like, and if I'm incorrect, and I can always change this later. I feel like we don't have quite the diversity on the eastern end of the continent there is on the western end, as far as squirrel diversity. And I'll talk about a couple of those that are pretty obvious. But we still have some neat ones, and we have some critters that a lot of people probably aren't always aware are in the family. What I thought I'd do is kind of focus on fox squirrels, which is the one on the left, and eastern fox squirrels on the left, and eastern gray squirrels which is the one on the right. And through that lens, we'll talk about a couple of things that they do, and hopefully it'll be kind of a gateway to some other members of the family. Cirrus, I'm getting a lot of background noise. If someone can mute their microphone, that would be fantastic. Cirrus species, Skia is the Greek for shade, and Ura is the Greek for tail, and I just thought that was fantastic that they're named shade tail. Cirrus species, this is the more traditional squirrels we think of: the gray squirrel, fox squirrel, Abert squirrel, and a few others. So our eastern gray squirrel, I think this is one of those ones that probably has that strongest feeling. This is your bird feeder robber, or bird feeder guest, again, depending on your viewpoint. They are pretty well established in the east, and they're in the eastern U.S., and they're also found in a few other places as well. This is also an eastern gray squirrel. I have people tell me all the time about the black squirrels they see, and it is black, and it is a squirrel. but it is still the eastern gray squirrel. It is melanistic, excuse me, so it has some extra pigment. I feel like if you really look at the incidences of melanistic eastern gray squirrels, you tend to find them the further north you go, you tend to find them more regularly in natural populations. There are some areas where they have been introduced. I went to school for a year in Kent, Ohio, and they had a pretty good population of black squirrels. And there was, of course, a story about how they got introduced. I've heard stories about how they've been introduced in a couple of different areas down here in the DC area. How true all those are is another story, but you will find pockets of them. But I do feel like if you look in gray squirrel populations, the further north you go, the more prevalent you'll find the melanistic form. This is the natural range of eastern gray squirrels. You can see, hopefully you can see my mouse. You can see it's a eastern seaboard or eastern U.S. Somewhat past the Mississippi. They kind of peter out, obviously, at the Great Plains where there's just not the right kind of habitat for them. Go a little further up here into Canada. They go a little further west up here in Canada naturally. Now, let me show you a few points where they have been introduced around the world. Or many, depending on how you look at that. You can see Hawaii, they've been introduced, all three Pacific states, California, Oregon, Washington, British Columbia, Calgary, a few other places in Canada. They've been introduced in Bermuda. I think I may have missed my arrow with Bermuda here. The Azores, the Canary Islands, Madeira, both Ireland and the UK, Italy. They've introduced it South Africa, excuse me, and even in a couple different areas in Australia. There's another squirrel, maybe palm squirrel. I think if that's correct, but the palm squirrel I think might be a kind of palm squirrel, one of the palm squirrel species introduced in Australia as well. So they've been introduced around the world, and they tend to not have a positive effect. This is the Eurasian red squirrel, which is I think pretty much been almost completely pushed out by the introduction of the American gray squirrel in mainland Britain along the island. They are not as the gray squirrel is not quite as successful against the red squirrel in Ireland. Part of the thing that happens here for the gray squirrels is they're a little larger. They're able to accumulate, I think, fat and also use more food resources better than the red squirrel, and so they actually have certain advantages, which is how they've outpressured or outcompeted them in the populations here in Britain. They have, I think, more recently been introduced in Italy, and there's a concern there as well in both these areas that that they could lead to an extirpation of the red squirrels in both those areas. Over here in the western U.S., you'll actually find that the gray squirrel is also often the most predominant squirrel, at least in urban and suburban areas, and that can lead to pressures on some western species out there as well. And another squirrel that can lead to that is the fox squirrel. The fox squirrel is another one that does really well in some urban areas. I feel like I don't see it very often here in Arlington. I've seen them definitely in some of the urban areas, and even in the National Mall over in DC. And there's other places around here. We do have in the region a really neat subspecies, which is federally protected, I believe. This is the Delmarva fox squirrel, and it is a subspecies. Excuse me, the fox squirrel. A couple good places to see them are Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge and Prime Hook. I've seen them both there. So obviously Delmarva, the Delaware, Maryland, Virginia Peninsula. I say that because when I moved here, I had no idea what Delmarva was the first couple times I heard it until someone took a second to explain how that works. So just in case there's anybody that's new or hasn't heard that phrase before. But the Delmarva fox squirrel, again, is one of these subspecies, and it is federally protected. So it's kind of fun to see the squirrel. And you can see it's definitely got a different coloration from the regular form of the eastern fox squirrel. I used to work in Colorado, and I worked at a park for 1 year as a seasonal where they had a ponderosa pine forest, which looks a lot like this. Very different from our traditional eastern forest. You can see there's a lot of space in between the trees. And this is very healthy. This is the kind of spacing that these ponderosas need. It helps with surviving forest fire. It makes it so that there's not dense, so you don't have as hot a fire or as heavy a fire load, and so that can help protect the trees. This is one of the areas where you'll find Abert squirrel. You can look at those really cool tufts of on the ears there. These guys were a lot of fun to see. They didn't see them very often, and they're almost slow. They almost look like they're in slow motion. They do the bound like squirrels, but it's a doop 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 doop. It's just a very slow bound, and they are pretty much an obligate associate to ponderosa pines. You don't really find them in other kinds of forests. And in some areas, I know, at least around, I remember around Denver, and I don't know how much this is an issue somewhere else, you start to get these fox or gray squirrels into the urban areas. And when the urban areas encroach towards the ponderosa pine forest, you have these squirrels move into those forests, and they are more aggressive, and they will outcompete the Abert squirrel. So in areas where you had, suburban or urban spread, encroaching on these natural areas, you had these squirrels moving in and becoming an issue for the Abert squirrel, particularly, which is not nearly as widespread as either the fox or the gray squirrel, because they are more dependent on a very specific kind of habitat. In the eastern chipmunk, another member of our squirrel family. I want to mention a couple others. This is number one of the other ones that is found in Virginia and also in Arlington. Pretty common. I think pretty used to seeing them. This is, I think, pretty typical for the markings. There's a little bit of striping around the eye, not a whole lot, and you can see the striping on the back. Eastern chipmunks, I think, are really familiar and common sight for us. There's actually 22 species of chipmunk in North America. We have one. To get to the other species of chipmunks, you really got to head out west and fan out, and you'll find some really interesting ones. They're beautiful too. This is, where did I put this picture in here? This is a chubby-cheeked guy here from up in Canada. So they do extend further north up into Canada and out west as well. Chipmunks can feed up to 65 feet up in trees. Excuse me, but they don't need as big or as tall a forest canopy as, say, squirrels. They have their dens underground, and so they don't have as much of a need for trees for housing and other things, but they still do depend on food from trees. Is very significant for them. Here we go. Least chipmunk up on the upper left here, or upper right. On the lower right, this is a yellow pine chipmunk. This one, the yellow pine chipmunks from Washington State. This least chipmunks from northern Colorado. I think these are actually, the least chipmunks pretty common. You can see slight coloration differences. You see a lot more pronounced striping across the head, which I feel is much more common for these species. I was looking in my National Audubon Society Field Guide to Mammals, and it said that they had recently taken I'm going to skip a couple slides here, so I hope you can stay with me. They'd taken this Tamias genus of the eastern chipmunk and merged it with the Eutamias, that would be EU Tamias genus of the western chipmunks, to put them all in one genus, and that has been done recently. So I was looking at, obviously, the Neotamias here and thinking, well, that's not at all what's in the book. So I went to the copyright in my field guides from 1996, so more than 25 years old. So since that publishing, they decided to go back and pop out the eastern chipmunk in its own genus, and combine a lot of these western chipmunks into a new genus, Neotamias, and neo meaning new. So I just thought that was great that they didn't even go back to the old genus, but they used one different. Or maybe that Eutamias is a genus being used for chipmunks or squirrels in some other area. But again, if you go out west, keep an eye on the chipmunks. They're differently colored. This one's got nice bright orange flanks here. A lot of fun to see them. And again, other than that, you see chipmunks in a different area. There are a lot of the similar habitats and behaviors, but they're just a little more brightly colored, a little differently colored. It's fun to see a different kind of chipmunk, but be careful because they are also very rude, and they will photobomb your photos of other critters. I think this is also a least chipmunk here, just took a run for it while I was trying to photograph this junco. So we had the gray squirrel and the chipmunk, and this is one of the third of the squirrel family that you'll find in Arlington. Only a couple of accounts there, and this is the woodchuck, or you can call it the groundhog or the marmot. Whistle pig is still my favorite. If I wasn't going to go with woodchuck, I'd probably go with or groundhog, I'd go with whistle pig because it's really neat. They have a high pitched whistle that they can make as a warning. When they see danger, not dissimilar to the communication you might see in things like prairie dogs. So Marmota monax is the name. If you go to the Midwest, use my cursor here, you can see that. You can see this is a almost like a reddish brown on the chest here. This will actually be silver colored on Midwestern woodchucks like Michigan, that more Midwestern area there, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois. And so that's kind of neat. Just these slight color variations among geographic populations. And so this is actually a member of the squirrel family. I think it's our largest member of the squirrel family, at least in North America. And if you don't believe me that it's a member of the squirrel family, there's one in a tree. They are, even though they have underground dens, and that's where they tend to go, they are pretty good at climbing. My favorite story I always love telling people about woodchucks is driving on the highway. And it was one of those highways where or it was one of those areas next to a farm where they had the really big chain link fence, which was like these big squares, maybe, 6 or 8 inches by 6 or 8 inches. And it's certainly going to keep out big critters, but not smaller ones. And there's a woodchuck just hanging. I don't know if you guys can see me. I think you kind of can. Just hanging on that fence, watching the cars go by on the highway, just kind of chilling there. So they are pretty good climbers. You don't see it very often because that's doesn't tend to be where they usually normally do. But they will climb for food or to get away from a potential predator if the predator gets between them and their underground den. The fourth member of the squirrel family you'll find in Arlington. It's probably the hardest one to see because they're only out at night, unless you got a nest box and it's a little bit easier. But these are the southern flying squirrels. We're kind of at the northern end of their range. We might even have some overlap with the northern species, but this is typically the one you'll find around here. And they are, unlike the other two we talked about, they are nocturnal. You look at those big eyes there that can, on the face of it, make them cute, but also help them get a little more light in and see better when they're out at night. And then, of course, they have the patagium. You can see the wrinkles right there. And the patagium stretches from ankle to ankle, and it's like a big parachute, and they can jump from tree to tree and glide. They don't fly. Hopefully, everybody here would know that, but they don't. They do glide. They can use their tail for a little bit of steering. And I just learned. I'm trying to remember the number here. I was just talking with another staff member, but she said when it's over. They often don't come out if the wind is higher than like 9 or 10 miles per hour, because it obviously would mess with if they're just gliding, which is a little more passive than actively flying. A high wind can mess with their accuracy and ability to decide, indicate where they're going. And so if the wind gets too high, the flying squirrels don't come out. I thought that was just a really, really neat little fact there. I'm actually not going to talk much about the flying squirrels because Long Branch does have some good programs that does that. If you want to learn more about flying squirrels, you really should get out to their programs. They do a really nice job, and they put nuts and things out to attract them so that they come out regularly, so you have a good chance of seeing one.
Hey, Ken?
Yes.
Hi. So how do you spell patagium?
I believe it's Patagium. Okay. So hopefully you can see that tail is actually flattened, and so that means that that's part of it as well. They have one more thing. One of my favorite facts about them that hopefully some of you may already know is as soon as they hit a tree, they go do a 180 around the tree to the other side. So if they have somebody chasing or trying to catch them, and owls do prey on them, the first thing they do when they hit the tree is get to the other side to put the tree between them and any potential danger. And so it's really neat and fun to watch them do that. All right. So let's talk about something that unites and links us all together, and that is the need for food. And it leads us to a couple of different things, and so that's where I wanted to start today. I really would love to get through the life history of a lot of these guys, and they just don't have the time. It's a big group, and there's a lot of interesting stuff here. But let's start with food because it's something we can all relate to. There is our gray squirrel. A lot of tawny on him, but he's a gray squirrel. He's not a fox squirrel. He's got a big nut in his mouth there. It's really, I think, stretching the limits of his teeth's ability to hold that. But what I really want you to look at is those ankles. Uh, if we tried to do what squirrels do with their ankles, we would be in traction, or at the least in quite a bit of pain. They can actually rotate those rear ankles 180 degrees, and squirrels have, because of that, squirrels have the ability to go head first down a tree, and then obviously they can go head first up a tree as well. But that gives them a lot of maneuverability on trees. I don't know if you've ever had the pleasure to watch a couple of squirrels chase each other. That usually means they're in love, or at least one of them thinks it's in love. And watching them go from tree to tree, going around, circling a trunk and going around, is just really, really fantastic. I don't know. I don't think that I put something else, another slide in for this. So I will say, if you want to watch squirrels, now we're in the winter, it's slightly different. But if you want to watch squirrels during, mid spring into mid fall, typically the best time to catch them is early in the morning. Or to maybe a couple of hours before sunset, which is technically crepuscular. They're very active at those times of day. In the winter, because it's cooler in the morning, they often avoid that morning outing and they just limit themselves to a couple hours in the afternoon, looking for food or um, trying to find food that they have stashed, which we will talk about more in a little bit. But what I did really want you to see is that 180 degrees on the ankle, which is pretty impressive, and that's what allows them their agility on the tree and to go down head first like this guy is right here. I've been yelled at by many a squirrel that was sitting on a tree head first and just letting rip with its a voice and also swishing that bushy tail at me. Oh, yeah, 180 degrees. So, what is on the menu? If you're a squirrel, there is plant material is first and foremost on the menu, and that include many different kind of tree nuts around here. They will also fairly regularly take insects in their pupa, amphibians, which I took to mean it could mean amphibians moving like in the spring. I also took that to mean that maybe they're a pretty significant predator on tree frogs. If they find them, they won't hesitate to eat them. The same goes for bird eggs and fledglings. They don't necessarily go after adult birds, but they will, be more than happy to snack on a nest full of eggs or fledglings. And that's one of my favorite things to tell people because that always kind of turns their head and sometimes makes them feel even less happy about squirrels than before. But they will not pass up an easy meal. Ease of use is really important on the right column there. What's the real choice? Ease of use. It's all about ease of use. Small mammals, do they catch them, eat them? That's even a part of their diet occasionally. And carrion. Obviously, carrion's a very easy thing because it doesn't fight back. As long as it doesn't make you sick, it doesn't fight back, and you don't have to chase it. It's a great way to find food. Um, what I say, what is the real choice, and what ease of use really refers to what are they going to eat, and how hard is it to get the food. So insects in their pupa, I don't know that they actively search for it, but when you're going up and down trees all the time and you're in the trees, you're going to find insects. You're going to find, their pupa, often cocoons or things they're left behind. And if they can make a snack out of it and it tastes good, great. They're probably, I guarantee you, they'll stumble on great tree frogs occasionally when they're out there, and maybe areas further south where there's other species. They come across these more than once, and if they can get them easily, great. Same with bird eggs and fledglings. So for these poor birds, you're trying to have your nest up in a tree away from predators on the ground, and then you got these nosy guys still trying to eat your eggs and nestlings when they find them up in the tree. So hiding these things is very important, or defending them from squirrels. Um, but coming back to tree nuts, things like acorns, hickory nuts, all these. Ease of use means how hard is it for that squirrel to dig into that nut and get to the meat, get to the good parts at the side of that. Because they're not, if they've got a nut that's really hard over here, like say a hickory, and they got an acorn which doesn't take nearly as much energy and effort to get into, they're going to go with the acorn first. What I found really interesting is um, they've went so far as to say, um, in describing squirrels' behaviors and eating, is that early on in the growing season, the squirrels will actually move from tree to tree and sample and see how these different nuts taste, almost as if they're window shopping ahead of when they're really going to knuckle down and start gathering nuts because to cache for the winter. Well, I thought that was really an interesting idea. Um, the other thing is when you're looking at the squirrel and you see it eating, you're thinking, "Oh, yummy! Hey, he's got food and he's eating it." What's really happening is the squirrel is inspecting each and every nut. What species is it? How much tannin is in it, especially if it's an acorn? Are they healthy and viable? Is that a good quality nut to eat? And then All these things are going to tell it, should it eat now? Should it store it for later? They tend to eat white oaks early and red oaks later for a couple of different reasons. Red oaks are hardier. They germinate slower. They usually germinate the following spring. White oaks will sometimes germinate within a few days of hitting the ground if the conditions seem right. And so eating white oak acorns ahead of time means you get them before they germinate and start using the energy that's in them to grow. You want that energy for your body. The other thing that's really good is if you take a red oak and store it underground and cache it, they tend to lose they have a higher tannin content. They tend to lose those tannins, leach some of those tannins out. So when the squirrel comes back to it later, it tastes better because there's less tannin. So that is a consideration as well. So, and the other thing is, if you're a squirrel and you find see if it's next. If you find a squirrel, if you're a squirrel and you find an acorn and it's got one of these critters in it, hey, bonus! As I mentioned, insects and pupa, they won't hesitate to eat that. On the right, or on the left, excuse me, is an acorn weevil, and on the left, or on the right, oh my goodness, left is an acorn weevil, right is an acorn moth. I think it's called an acorn moth. This moth will actually use the holes left in acorns to pupate before they come out as an adult. So it uses the holes because it can't bore its own holes. It uses the holes left by these acorn weevils. Acorn weevils bore a hole into acorns while they're still in the tree, lay an egg. The egg hatches. The pupa eats the interior of the acorn. When the acorn hits the ground, the pupa, or the larva eats the inside. The larva then crawls out and pupates in the ground after living in the ground for a couple years. And so if a squirrel happens to find an acorn that's got some of these larvae in it, fantastic. That's just an extra bit of meal. That old joke about the fly in your soup that won't eat much, or I grew up in a household with a depression era grandparent, and that food fell on the floor and you couldn't see dirt on it, you needed to eat that. We didn't waste food in our house. And so there was always the jokes about that bug won't eat much, or it's just a little extra protein. And for squirrels, that's very much true. These little critters inside the acorn, yum yum yum, it's just a little extra food, a little extra energy. They like to eat up high. This is the railing next to we have a fence around the pond at the nature center. This is the railing next to the fence, and here's a little squirrel meal that's been left behind. There's the nuts it was chewed on. I think these are hickory nuts, if I remember correctly. That's what they look like. We have or walnut. Maybe it's walnut. We have a walnut for sure next to the pond. There is a book. Remember the title correct. It's by a gentleman named Paul Rezendes, Rezendes, and if I remember correctly, it's called "Tracking in the Art of Seeing," and it mostly focuses on mammals. But it's a really good book. I recommend it for anybody that wants to learn tracks. In it, he also has pictures of acorns and other nuts, and shows how they were eaten differently by a chipmunk versus a gray squirrel. I think it's those two, maybe even versus a red squirrel. And I thought that was really fantastic. And that was a little too deep to get into, a little too much to get into tonight. But you can sometimes look at the nuts that are left behind and know who was eaten there. In our park, it's either gray squirrel or chipmunk, and they both like a high place. Sitting on that railing next to the pond, sitting on a rock, even sitting on the logs that we use to line the trails, just sitting on top of those is a few extra inches to, could be several feet, depending on how high the rocks are or how high that fence is. Excuse me. A few extra feet of, a few extra inches to a few extra feet of elevation helps them see around them. So while they're eating, it gives them a good sense of if anybody's trying to sneak up on them, if there's a predator nearby. And so it's a feeling or sense of security to eat high up like that. I did acorn programs for the pre-K in November, and I did it at the fire ring where we have several benches, and it was great because every time I went out there was a meal left over by either one of our chipmunks or squirrels, where they had left a mess on one of the benches. So it was easy to point to the kids and be like, "Here's where a squirrel or chipmunk ate their meal the other day." And so if you see, acorns or any other tree nuts like that shredded and in pieces on a bench like that, it's very likely a squirrel or chipmunk was eating there. I heard somebody. Was there a question or? No? Okay, just checking. So let's say you have made the decision that you don't want to eat right now. You instead want to cache your food. We're gonna bring in a couple of guests from out of town to talk about this. On the left is the American red squirrel. On the right is a southwestern red squirrel. They are two of the three species that are in this, to me, a serious genus. I'm horrible with Latin, so I don't know if I'm even saying it right. With this genus, the red squirrels, been, red squirrel. They often called pine squirrels, I think, is how the genus is referred to. I've heard them called chickarees. They have some really neat names as well, similar to the woodchuck, which has a whole host of names. Um, these guys are very much a species you're going to find in and around pine trees and conifers. You're not going to typically not going to find them in broadleaf plants. So that's why you don't see a lot of them around here. You got to go, I think, a little south or west in order to find these critters, get their range, because you want to get into some conifer forests. The southwestern red squirrel is one you'll find in. This picture is from somewhere in Colorado. Might be the I guess the Rocky Mountain National Park, which you'll find these critters at. But you see, this guy looks. Hopefully, you can see he looks a little tubbier than this guy on the right. This is definitely taken in winter. A lot of green, but those are evergreen. This is definitely taken in winter. The difference between the gray squirrel and these red squirrels, these pine squirrels, is that gray squirrels are scatter hoarders and red squirrels are larder hoarders. What does that mean? Well, gray squirrels will take a nut or several nuts and they'll cache them in the ground. They'll find a spot and they'll dig a little hole and stick it in and they'll cover it back up. They will do this pretty regularly. Sometimes they'll pick up their old cache and move it somewhere else. Sometimes they'll find someone else's and they'll pick that up and move it somewhere else. Now it's theirs. And their memory is actually pretty decent. I remember I used to like to tell kids, that we have these oak forests because of squirrels planting acorns and they're forgetting where they are, which is partially true. But the squirrels don't forget a lot. They have, in one of the studies I read, 95 to 99% recovery of caches. That's a really high rate. I don't remember 95 to 99% of where I've put anything. And so I think that's really impressive. Um, and you'll see them do this. You'll see them fussing with it. They'll move them there, and squirrels will even come over and pretend to stick something in the ground, or stick their acorn in the ground, and then pull it back up and go somewhere else. And they quote unquote fake caches, in case anybody's watching. So being observed is a pretty big deal to these critters because they don't want you knowing where their food is. Now, because gray squirrels scatter their hordes around in all these different places, they are actually less territorial than the red squirrels, and I'll explain that in a second. And so their territories often overlap. They often have scent posts where they and the other squirrels that have the overlapping territory will mark to communicate space. But they're not as territorial as these red squirrels or pine squirrels are, who have these much bigger larders that tend to be one particular place. So the difference between a scatter hoarder and a larder hoarder is, in a scatter hoarder, you've got several different places. You don't have to be as worried, because if somebody finds one of your hoards, no big deal. They a small percentage of your food. But if somebody who eats the same stuff finds your larder hoarder, like these red squirrels make, that could be a really, really big impact on your life, or in survival, because that's kind of everything you got in one. And they can be pretty messy. You can see this midden pile here from where this pine squirrel's eaten. This is, again, Rocky Mountain National Park. I think I'm looking at this, and I think these might actually be from Douglas fir. But if you look at this pile, this is up in Algonquin Park in Canada. That is a pretty significant midden pile. And it made quite a mess. And can be habitual and will eat in similar places to do that, and certainly eat high up, and that's how you get these larder piles from. Or if you're an eastern chipmunk, like this guy here, look at those big puffy cheeks. Chipmunks have pouches inside their cheeks, so when they are sitting there chewing something and just stuffing their cheeks full, they're actually often are nibbling off. You can see there's some sunflower seeds here. The person I'm with was hand feeding this chipmunk, which I don't recommend. But you can feed these chipmunks, I'm sorry, you can't feed the chipmunks. The chipmunks will find these seeds. They will nibble off the sharp ends so that it doesn't hurt their pouches, and they'll stuff their pouches full. And sometimes I've seen way bigger cheeks than this on some of our chipmunks. And once they get their cheeks to capacity, or there's nothing else to find, they'll run back to their den, and they take their paws. Again, I'm hoping you can see me. If not, I'll show you again at the end. They take their paws and take essentially what's the heel of their paw, put it at the back of their mouth, and just push forward and just empty their pouches into this pile of food that they're collecting all throughout spring and summer as they get ready for the winter. I'll talk more about why they need that in a little bit too. Um, excuse me. But they are able to put them in those pouches. So the other cool thing about this is it's not covered with saliva. I think we can all agree if you've had something in your mouth and you pull it back out and then try to put it in a plate and put it in the fridge, it's not going to have the same qualities it did before you put it in your mouth. And so they have those pouches that keep their saliva away from all the stuff that they're stuffing in there. And like I said, they'll nibble off the corners to keep them from being too sharp when they shove them in there. So since we're in winter, I thought it was important to point out how these critters stay warm. You got three options. Oh, sorry. Well, you got four. You could just completely avoid it, which is what groundhogs do. Groundhogs, and this is yellow-bellied marmot. They're both marmots. They have the same genus name. They are true hibernators around here. Groundhogs probably are our best example of a true hibernator. When you hibernate, your body temperature drops significantly, and for all intents and purposes, it's very, very hard to revive you. And so our groundhogs around here, I can't say how long they'll actually hibernate. We're at the southern end, or at least towards the southern end of their habitat, their range, excuse me, and they don't sleep probably nearly as long here as they would like in where I grew up in northwestern PA, or even further up into New England or Maine. Now this yellow-bellied marmot, excuse me, is probably, I think we're above the tree line here, so it's definitely a distinct elevation, and it gets colder there faster. It stays snowy there longer. This marmot might spend 7 to 8 months in hibernation from say September to May, which is a really significant stretch. And then they come out and have their young really, really quickly and keep going. Now, at lower elevations, it might be earlier and later to go in, earlier to come out. But higher elevations, the higher elevations within their range, they could only have 3 or 4 months of active time each year. And somebody did the calculations on that, and they said with the time they spend underneath, taking care of their den and cleaning it out, hiding in there, sleeping in there, and then of course the 7 to 8 months hibernation, they spend about 80% of their life inside that den that they've made. So that's a pretty significant, pretty long time to be hibernating. But if you can't just sleep off winter, well, there's a couple other things you can do. Here's our gray squirrel again with his tail. At the base of their tail, there is a bundle of blood vessels. They can actively, that bundle of blood vessels controls, I don't know how active it is, but I will say that bundle of blood vessels controls blood flow into the tail. During the summer, let it flow. You can lose heat through that tail. During the winter, when it's cold out, maybe restrict that blood flow a little bit. Keep more of that blood inside the body and where it can stay, help keep the core warm. And so that tail, through that blood flow mechanism of this bundle of blood vessels, can actively help that squirrel thermoregulate, which is really, really important, especially in the winter. In the winter, they are, because they're active, because they're not sleeping, they have some pretty high nutritional demands to be able to stay active and find the food that they need. So they actually will also bulk up on the food that they're eating prior to winter to put on some fat as well, because there will be days where they don't want to leave the tree. But I think we can all understand that. Excuse me. Another option is to shiver. I think we've all been there as well. Shivering can certainly help warm up squirrel as well. Here's a fox squirrel he's cuddled in. The other thing you can see is tails wrapped around to help shield the back from some air, and he's also up against the side of the tree there, so he's hopefully braced himself somewhat out away from the wind as well. Third option. On a cold day, if you can find, this is a early spring day, but on a cold day, if you can find a spot where the sun's really hitting you, do a little sunbathing. Catch yourself some rays. Look at that. That is the most comfortable looking squirrel I have ever seen. And just laying out there, kind of relaxing. There are a few, hopefully he's alert, because that's probably not the safest bet, but he's just kind of chilling there. And the marmots will do that as well. This is a marmot up on up on one of the 14ers in Colorado, and he had on this nice sunny day. You can see it's all kind of in shadow back there, and this little rock outcropping sticking up, and it's getting a little sun there. And he has just laid himself out there and really pulling up that the sun's radiation, trying to get himself some warmth there.
Hey, Ken.
Yeah.
Um, I've seen squirrels at Arlington Cemetery drape themselves over the tops of the marble tombstones.
Yeah.
So is that to keep cool? Is that, or are they sunning?
Is it summer or is it winter?
Summer.
Summer. That might be to help cool as well. If that, especially like if it's in the morning, that might help cool them down, because the rock can be really cool. But in the middle of the day or late in the day, that's probably not going to help, because that would be pretty warm as well. That was the other thing I was thinking about, is besides feeling warm to the marmot here, the sun is also warming up this rock, and that can help with keeping warm as well. But yeah, just laying out like that, sometimes it's about thermoregulating. You letting heat out or getting more heat in. It's interesting that you saw that in the summer. I have to think more about that, but I could see them laying out like that on, especially in the shade on one of those tombstones. Staying out of harm's way. Um, you might occasionally stumble on squirrels. Squirrels are pretty, and most members of this family are pretty alert. They keep pretty good eye on it and everything. Hopefully, from this picture, you can see the squirrel's eyes are actually located on the sides of its head, which means their binocular vision is not very good, but they have a much wider field of vision. And so they're able to see quite a bit more around them. So you're going to watch out for danger. This is very typical of a prey species. They're actually able to run. They can reach speeds of 75 miles per hour when they go bounding, so they can move pretty quick. And that'll give you this horrible exposure on a picture on a low light level day. Um, if you're a squirrel, typically a gray squirrel, fox squirrel, they make these leaf nests called drays. They use these a lot in the summer. They can also use them in the winter. They tend to be smaller and more compact if they make them in the winter. The winter, they may also try to find a tree cavity that'll suit their needs. It's a little more protective from the winter wind. So that can be a pretty big deal. They often find a place where they can start with a platform over a couple of interconnected twigs or branches. I see them a lot in the V's of trees like this as well. There's a lot of, this actually looks like it might be in a little bit of disrepair. Maybe it's the previous year's dray. But there's a lot of leaf material in there. Inside, they will line it with some softer stuff, so like lichens and finer plant material to make it softer. Actually watched Crow once try to tear a dray apart. I don't know what it expected to find. I don't think it was the season when you're going to find baby squirrels in there. But these are pretty easy to spot, especially right now with all the leaves off the trees. You can get out there and you can spot squirrel drays like crazy, which is a lot of fun. Give you an idea of how many squirrels are actually out there. If you're some of its cousins, like the groundhog or the chipmunk, you're heading for an underground burrow. Or an underground culvert in this case here. I don't think that he had a den in there. I think that was simply another place to hide to stay away from danger. Personally, groundhogs are pretty big, and they have those typical rodent teeth. They're really front incisors on the top, and really big incisors on the front and the top and the bottom. I don't think I would be, if I was a predator, that groundhog is not the first critter I'd be messing with. This is a nice illustration. It's pretty common one. I think you'll see in a lot of publications of a woodchuck's burrow. Okay, you can see that we got a couple of different chambers here. This chamber here with the bedding is for sleeping. I'm not sure exactly what this is for. I do know that chipmunks will often make an extra one, and that's where they'll go to defecate during the winter when they have sealed themselves in. But these burrows are typically dug deep enough to avoid freezing, and in areas further north of here, that could be as deep as 6 feet. That they can dig a hole so that they can make sure that when they are hibernating, they're below the freeze line. Because if they're not below the freeze line, no amount of hibernating is going to save you from your body freezing solid if it gets really really super cold. Um, they often have more than one entrance in case anybody chases them in, but more likely they can head towards this entrance if there's danger, and if they get cut off by the predator, well, they got a second plunge hole over here. That's another way to get in. So usually one is a little more obvious than the other, and that's also kind of a strategy that's meant to help them out. If you ever find what you think is a woodchuck or groundhog den, one of the easiest ways to tell if it's occupied is to simply check and see if there's fresh dirt out of it. They are pretty meticulous and pretty regular do pretty regular maintenance work in their burrows, and so you almost always see a pile or even like a ridge of fresh dirt and material that's been pulled out of there because they would do it almost constantly. And so an active woodchuck den site will definitely have fresh dirt outside of the entrance. As I mentioned, chipmunks also have underground. They will, both the chipmunks and the woodchucks are happy to go up a tree if that's what they need to do to get away from a predator. But their first preference is always going to be to go underground. This is from, and I'll show you the book here when we're done. This is, I couldn't find anything online, so this is from the Peterson Reference Guide Behavior of North American Mammals, which is a fabulous book. And it's a simple burrow. They just like the woodchuck, they got a couple entrances. There is a chamber where the chipmunk gathers all of its food. They put their food in there. They usually put some bedding material on there as well, so they sleep and eat in the same space. They usually have a second chamber for um, uh, evacuating waste. So if you're thinking in your head they have a bathroom, yes, they do, because you don't want to pee and poop where you also eat and sleep. So you have a second chamber for that. During at some point in fall, hopefully it's when they've gathered enough food or when it's just the light tells them it's the time or the temperature tells them it's time, they will plug both entrances. Excuse me, they plug both entrances. There are in most of the places where chipmunks live also weasels. And weasels are long and skinny, and they're very good at getting down in these tunnels. So they want to make sure they do a good job of plugging these up so there's no unwanted visitors during the winter. Excuse me. And so they will plug both these up. But they plug it, and they plug it for length. You don't want to make it easy. You don't want to be like just plug the entrance, and that'd be really easy for a predator to break through. So they plug it for a significant length there to make sure that'll keep other animals out. Um, oh, one more thing about flying squirrels. If you see boxes like this around the parks, these are flying squirrel boxes. They're meant as a habitat improvement. During the winter, flying squirrels are often more communal than they would be. They're a little more territorial during the spring, summer, and fall. But in the winter, they're a little more communal. It has to do with pooling warmth. If you can get a few other buddies to hang out with you inside a flying squirrel box, you're all going to stay pretty warm. So you'll see these on some of the trees in and around Arlington. Um, Not with these shiny hinges. I forget where I got this picture from, but it's not one of ours. Um, I mentioned those holes earlier. Oh, let's come back to this. I'll come back to the prairie dogs. So woodchuck holes are prized. They will be used by other critters if the woodchuck abandons it or dies. Skunks are just going to make dig a hole in the ground and then to an ending. So skunks will happily take an abandoned woodchuck burrow because it's a lot more fancy than what they would do. Foxes might take over a burrow as well to use it for raising their pups. But the kings really of or the kings and queens, if you will, of making burrows that are usable by other critters are really the prairie dogs. The Cinnamus is a genus of 5 species that you only find in North America. It's the white-tailed and black-tailed prairie dogs are the ones pictured here. There's also Gunnison's Utah and a Mexican. I think Mexican is the 5th one. Those are the 5 species of prairie dogs you'll find in North America. They can have some pretty significant sizes of their communities, and most prairie dog communities have been found. I think the study I read was with black-tailed prairie dog. Um, they found a positive correlation between black-tailed prairie dog communities, and about 200 other species. So not just other animals that will use the den, but animals that will eat the prairie dogs, plants and other organisms that benefit from the feces of the critters. Because think about it, again, they're plant eaters. Plant eaters poop a lot. That's what they do. And so there's a lot of benefit from being around these critters, not only making these areas, but then they get the prairie dogs get eaten, they abandon them, whatever. You have things like burrowing owls and rattlesnakes, even small canines, like some small types of foxes might use these burrows as well. There's plants that benefit from it. I think there was even a link between prairie dog towns and like pronghorn antelope. And it's probably because of the plants that grow there, and then it brings in the pronghorn. So there's all these different animals, and so they're actually considered a keystone species. It's a pretty big deal. Just like when I talked about earlier about the squirrels and how any acorns that they forget or any nuts that they cache and they forget can potentially grow into new trees to help rejuvenate the forest. These critters as well make a really big impact in their ecosystem for not just themselves but for many other organisms as well. So these squirrel species can be pretty important. As you can see, I only talked about a couple things, and we're almost up to the hour here. I ran out of it. I knew I would have um, a lot of stuff. I like picking a big topic, so I have places to go. But there's so much more. I could have done a whole week on squirrels. It would have been fabulous. I think squirrels are fantastic. We have a bird feeder in our backyard. Full disclosure, I do get irritated with the squirrels from time to time. One of the most common sounds you'll hear in our house is my daughter banging on the window to scare the squirrels off of the bird feeder. She considers that a very important, very sacred duty, and she does it often and with a lot of gusto. Um, and again, they're part of the ecosystem, and it's wonderful to have them. So I hope that you got a little appreciation of them. And again, there's tons of them around the world. There's 279 species, if I remember that number correctly. It's well over 200, closer to 300, I think, species of squirrels around the world. So there's always some really neat ones to see, and they occupy a lot of different niches. I didn't even talk about ground squirrels, the different kinds of ground squirrels here. So if anybody has any questions, now would be a great time if you want to ask. I'm actually going to try to pull up the chat while we're here and see if there's any questions I missed. So the oak trees are probably growing from the buried acorns of gray squirrels. Either either they died or they forget. Like they don't have a perfect um, record for finding the acorns, but they do really really well. But again, if they end up caching a few white oaks, and then the white oaks don't they don't get back to them really quickly. White oaks germinate really fast. So it just all depends on how much they remember. So it's a good question, Peter. Yeah, but they don't get all the acorns. And if you think about how long it takes for the forest to grow and mature, having this constant seeding of acorns can only be helpful. Melanie, I think I saw your hand up.
Yeah.
Okay.
So there's this really good YouTube video of this guy that set up this obstacle course for the squirrels.
You guys keep getting ahead of me. So anybody that's on here that's not part of Arlington Master Naturalists, I send these out ahead of time to remind people, hey, I've got this, and you come do the program because they get continuing education credit for it. And one of the Master Naturalists responded with a clip from a guy. I can't remember his name, but I fully plan on including that in the email I send out when I send out the survey email and the link to the recording. And this guy apparently had a lot of time on his hands when COVID started, and he built this what almost looks like, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the American Ninja game show, but it looks like one of these massive obstacle courses you would see like at basic training or something like that. And that was the only way the squirrels had to go through all these in order to get there. And he says at the very beginning, he was like, I thought I made it really hard, but I completely underestimated my foe. And so it's definitely worth it. And I'm going to include it there as well. Include that. There's another video that went just a little minute long where there's a video of looks like a juvenile red shoulder hawk with a rat that's caught sitting on this fence, and there's a squirrel that just comes out and is just looking at this hawk and can't seem to decide what to do, and starts to get closer, and then the hawk's like, what? And then the squirrel sits back, and it's just about a minute of this, and finally the squirrel just sits back and is staring at this hawk, and then just starts itching itself and grooming its tail. And it's almost cat-like in the indifference that the squirrel shows this predator. But this predator had food, so I don't know what the hawk would have done, or I don't know if the squirrel thought maybe you could get part of that rat away, because again, they will eat, carry other stuff, but it was a neat little thing. So I was going to throw those two videos in, but yes, Melanie, thanks for reminding me about that. It was a really neat and interesting thing. And again, there's a lot of squirrel love out there on the internet. There's also a lot of squirrel hate. I mean, they seem to be one of those really polarizing critters, and a lot of it just has to do with either gardening or feeding birds.
But what was really cool is
not help. What's that?
What was really cool is the video that he got of he is able to figure out, and you can see it on the video, how the squirrel, when they were flung by the machine, could actually turn itself in the air and look to where it was going to plant its feet so that it could then land like safely. And it was like, really, I played that video over and over again to see how that squirrel had that kind of vestibular ability. It's like,
Yep.
whoa.
So that reminds me, and Gary, I see your question. I'll answer that in a second. So this is the book I was mentioning. I hope it comes through. It is, what do I have to do to get it there? Behavior of, okay, I'm just gonna read it. Behavior of North American Mammals, and it's a Peterson reference guide. So it's not a field guide. It's more of an informational book, and it's fantastic. It's got a lot of North American mammals, and I highly recommend it. But one of the things they talk about is squirrels seem to have this propensity that they can fall out of trees, and it happens kind of regularly, and they don't get hurt. And again, you got to think of the difference. I've watched my daughter take a flying leap and fall and miss, and she just gets up and she's like, and I'm weigh a lot more than her. Not gonna say how much. And I'm also a lot older and a lot less flexible. And she can do things that would put me in traction or out of commission for several days. And squirrels seem to have that flexibility. And they're also smaller, so they're not going to hit with the same amount of force if they do fall out of the tree. And yes, Gary, I have heard that as well, and I think that's true. I think part of it has to do with less competition at night from other squirrels, at least less direct competition, but also we don't simply see them, and that they're, sorry, Gary's question was that he's heard that there are more flying squirrels in our area than gray squirrels. And as far as I understand, that is correct. Be surprised at what critters are actually the most numerous out there, and a lot of times it tends to be the ones we don't see. Flying squirrels are very active at night. I've seen them in several areas, but even when it's not always easy to see. What I recommend is, if you really want to know if the flying squirrels are out there, especially if you're in an area next to a forest, find out what they sound like. They do have some pretty easy to identify call. I can't remember exactly what it sounds like, but I know once you know it and you hear it, you'll never forget it. You'll be like, oh, flying squirrel. It'll just come at you out of nowhere if you're walking through the woods, and that's really neat. Go ahead, Stephanie. I see you have a question.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Sure. Yeah, I can. Yep.
Okay, great. So what happens when a squirrel loses its tail?
Could you say it louder? I'm sorry.
What happens when a squirrel loses its tail?
So they lose obviously a little bit of thermoregulation. They lose some of their ability to balance. Squirrels' tails are very important for balancing as well, but they can survive without it. I think a lot of times we see those more in our areas where that squirrel. I always call them lucky. I'm like, hey, there's Stubby, or hey, there's Lucky. Because obviously they got away from whatever is trying to get them like that. But they lose some of that ability, but it doesn't mean they're unable to function. I've heard stories about deer that injure a leg pretty badly, and then they survive because either the leg ends up falling off because it's so injured so badly, or they figure out how to survive with one leg that doesn't work as well as the others. And so I think for squirrels that is an impediment, but it's not an automatic failure if they don't have most or all of their tail. So, and they look silly, look like a really hairy rat sometimes. I have seen that, yeah. I've had squirrel visit. Yeah, I've seen flying squirrels visit my bird feeders. My favorite story. I meant to say this, and now that it's a little over 8, I'm going to gratuitously talk about my mother for a minute. They used to have this backyard, and it was just like there was like 20 yards between trees, and so they put this feeder out, and the squirrels kept climbing at the pole. So they put a baffle, and the squirrels could sometimes get by the baffle. But what they had also done was they put this half dome over it to keep the squirrels from jumping from the trees to land on the bird feeder. And sometimes you'd be sitting there in like the living room talking or watching TV or something, and you'd hear this boom, and you look out and there'd just be the squirrel like on a cartoon. It had just hit the plastic and it'd just be like and slide off of it. And then shake it off and they walk back and they try again and they never learn. But they would literally jump from 20, 30 feet up to land on this plastic dome, and it always made this loud noise. And for the most part, it shed them. Occasionally, they got rewarded with it, and I'm sure that's what they were remembering. So cool. Well, it's 8:02. Unless anybody has any questions, thank you for joining me. I was bummed I didn't get to do one last month, but it kind of worked out with the timing. But it's been 2 months, and I'm super excited. Oh, before I forget, next month is not virtual. It is in person at Lubber Run Center. There's only 30 spots available. Get them now. Tickets are going fast. They're actually free. But I'd love to see some people in person. I like to tell funny stories. Obviously, nobody can hear me, or I can hear nobody laugh back if I'm actually even funny. But this will be a chance to kind of meet in person and do a deep dive. It's on. I love February because I always do mating ones. So this one is. I did Trying to Find Love, Dying for Love, love by yourself, you know. And so next one's group love. So love that's more than two. So that'll be the subject. I don't know if I'll be able to record it, but I will probably try to figure out a way to record it so I can still post something for anybody that's either can't make it or is uncomfortable with trying to do an in-person program. But the new Lover Run Center at Rec Center, if you haven't seen it yet, it's fantastic. And that's where I'll be holding it. Is in the I can't remember the name of the room, but we'll get that information out when I send the registration out. So thanks everybody. You all have a where can we reserve space for that? So
Thank you,
Janine,
Ken.
that is still on. It's online. You can find it. It's the same number as this one. I think it's 622842, and I think it's -D, if I remember correctly. You can find that online to register through the county through RecTrack. All right, you're all welcome. Thank you so much for joining me. It's always fun to do these, and I look forward to doing many more.
Thanks, Ken.
You're welcome. Oh, Barbara, did you have a question? I see your hand raised.
Oh yeah, I just had a quick question.
Sure, go ahead.
So the squirrels, are they in their drays in the winter when it's super cold and it's snowy and just tail over them, or are they just with drays for the young?
So I think around here it's maybe not as important to find a tree cavity. I think the further north you go, probably the more likely they are going to find a tree cavity. You know, any kind of tree cavity, an old woodpecker or a nest that the woodpeckers aren't using. But they will use drays also in the winter. They do tend to make them smaller, more compact, which probably helps reduce wind coming through and helps them be a little warmer. But I feel like if it gets seriously cold, they're more likely to get into tree cavities. Just a little more insulated, a little better that way.
Okay.
And they do use a lot. Yeah, no worries. And because they're active in the winter, they do use a lot more calories. So like I said, they will try to fatten up some in the winter, but they also want to make sure they remember where that food is. And then if it's a really snowy day, because think about it, you get a couple inches of snow, but your squirrel's only this big. That can be tough moving around. And so on snow days, they stay in too sometimes. And so if they have that layer of fat and they've been eating pretty well, they can weather a day or two where they don't get out and find food. But it certainly helps to be in an area where you can do some less shivering at least.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, no problem. All right, I'm going to sign off because I'm going to go put my daughter to bed. So good night, everybody. Thank you so much.
Good night.
Good night.